Hello friends, and welcome back to the Air Effect. I don't know why I like to do these, sitting on the floor updates when I'm filming a vlog, but it is what it is. Today, I thought I would share a writing vlog with you, and then I am going to potentially read the first chapter of my book for you at the end of this video. This whole week, actually for the past 2 weeks, all I've wanted to do is write. I read a book that really inspired me to get going, not because of the book itself. I mean, it was a really good book. So I read this book and then I went back and I found some of her older writing, and it's not as... it's still entertaining, but I don't think I would have chosen to look her up if I had read one of her older stories first. And that was kind of encouraging to me to be like, this is an author whose, the first book I read from her was, you know, her most recent. I thought it was really good. It was very much up my alley. But then her older books, you can definitely see the improvement in her writing from then to now. And that was really encouraging to me because I am a perfectionist when it comes to writing. I want things to be written perfect the first time. I hate editing. I hate having a bunch of drafts. I don't like having to revise things. I try to write so that I can have people read it and not feel like, oh, there's a bunch of things I have to point out that are wrong. So I'm a perfectionist, and one of the things that has been holding me back from publishing my novels is that I want them to be perfect, and I feel like I have to do really intense things to them to get them to where they're readable by people. So reading Harper St. George's older novels really inspired me to just sit and write and get this novel published, whether I think it's perfect or not, because it kind of encouraged me to see that you can put out content that's maybe not the best, but if you just keep doing it, someday you will get to a really great place. You know, I think we kind of forget that you don't have to be perfect the first time. So I thought I would share a writing vlog with all of you, and then I would maybe read the first chapter or some of the first chapter of this novel. And also you can go read all of what I have written currently on Wattpad. I decided to put it out online until I decide to publish. I think that a big part of how I write is by sharing it with other people. That has always been the thing that I love doing the most, was sharing my writing with people. At one point, I didn't really care about the money, and I still don't really care about the money. I just want to share my writing with people, and I do want to become published because that's like, you know, as a writer, that's like the big thing to accomplish, is to be published. But really I just want to share my writing with people. But yeah, I thought I would share with you a writing vlog. I thought I would let you guys know you can read my novel if you want to. And maybe it'll kind of make all of you more a part of this journey. I know my channel is not really about writing. My channel is more about vintage, but I always wanted to have all of my content, whether it be blogging or Instagram or or any other social media or YouTube, I always wanted it to be more about vintage and books. My two greatest loves are vintage fashion and books and writing. I guess that's 3 loves, but So I am trying to introduce more book and writing content into this channel because my main goal is to publish novels. That is like the number one thing that I'm passionate about, is writing. And I would really like to incorporate that into this channel, and I don't know if this will even do very well. I know that people don't come to my channel to watch about writing videos. They come to my channel to watch weird recipes and vintage fashion, but it is what it is. I just want to keep doing what I love and not push myself to make content just because I think other people are going to like it. So now I'm going to read some of my book to all of you, which hopefully you all will like it. The moment Rhys McNamon showed her to her suite of rooms, Katrina Belfry McNamon knew one thing without a shadow of a doubt. She hated her new husband. She had heard rumors of the Laird of Calhoun Castle, which she had been entirely disinclined to believe as true, mainly because she had heard many false rumors about herself. So, when she had heard that Laird McNamon was said to be a cold and heartless man, abrupt in his ways and brutish with his power, she had waved off the whispers and rolled her eyes at the warning she'd be marrying nothing better than a bear caged in a dank castle. He'd killed a man with his bare hands, they said, and expected his orders to be obeyed with no resistance. He'd turned away his own family, according to some. He isolated himself. He was running from a dark past. None of these things seemed quite plausible to Katrina, seeing as he owned a large castle with vast surrounding lands, thriving with tenants, and a bustling village nearby. No man so bad as the rumors could have managed such a happy and prosperous community. Not a single farmer on his estate would say a word against him, and Katrina was wont to believe the words of those under his lairdship than the word of those stirring up a bit of gossip. But today, their wedding day, his dark countenance planted a seed of doubt in her mind. The man had barely glanced at her during their vows, and touched her only when it was necessary to put on the token of a ring, which he did with such swiftness it twisted her finger and chafed her skin. He dropped her newly bejeweled fingers as if they burned him, and ignored the slightly annoyed glare she'd given him. But she wouldn't be treated like a possession, to be picked up and dropped whenever he so chose. It was an arranged marriage, one of value to both families, of course, more land for the McNamons, and a chance to finally provide an heir to the vast estate, and money for the Belfrys. At the age of 26, Katrina had been considered far too old for marrying off, and was labeled a spinster past her prime. It was a label that had at first offended her, but eventually she took it on with a sardonic sense of pride. She was the old maid who could ride with the best of the men, hunt with no one to chastise her for endangering herself, and do whatever she wanted with little to no disapproval. She had even begun pursuing her dream of becoming a midwife, which was fairly well accepted, except, of course, from her mother. Moira Belfry wanted her daughter to be a grand lady of an estate, which did not include midwifery, hunting, sardonic replies, nor sparring in trousers. The last of these perhaps put her mother out the most, for showing herself not only taking part in a mannish activity, but also dressing like a boy. Katrina suspected that Moira's hopes of her becoming a lady had soared when the marriage had been arranged, and she intended to soundly disappoint her mother, especially now as she stood beside an overstuffed armchair and felt her gut overflowing with her newfound animosity for the man who now paced her rooms, inspecting every detail as if he cared that it be perfect. For whom, she wondered? Not her. His entire lack of touch and conversation through the entire wedding dinner, the abruptness of his wedding toast that merely thanked his guests for coming and said nothing about his bride, the almost rude manner in which he finally jutted his elbow toward her in a motion which meant they could now relieve the reception, none of it indicated he cared one whit about whether she was happy or displeased with her new situation. He had only vaguely responded to the many cheers for a good marriage, the jibes from his friends over the wedding night, the well-wishes. Though a smile had been on his face, she had seen that it did not reach his eyes. Not when he accepted a congratulatory handshake from his father, not when he had bowed over her mother's hand in thanks, not when he had taken her arm and led her toward the upstairs suite they now occupied. Upon arriving, his face had settled into indifference. Katrina stood in her wedding garments still. a deep blue gown with a wide neckline and delicate floral embroidery in green and yellow to offset the blue. The bodice was fitted, enhancing her waist and flaring into a plentiful skirt with the same green and yellow embroidery at the hem. She carried the McNammon tartan as a shawl hanging from her elbows. Her hair was braided and wrapped around her head and adorned with flowers to create a crown of color that surrounded her face. "Quite beautiful," her mother had said, patting her daughter's arm that morning and admiring her own handiwork of the embroidery on the dress. "You look splendid, Katrina. I always knew you'd make a beautiful bride, and thank heaven he's tall, you did inherit your grandmother's unfortunate tendency towards stature." Moira had clicked her tongue, gazed ruefully up at her daughter, and patted her arm again. "He'll be pleased, I'm sure," were her parting words to her child before the ceremony. But standing there now, Katrina's new husband barely acknowledged any of it. Finished with his inspection of the main room and its closets and bath, he finally stilled in the far corner of the room, face cast in shadows. It was evening now, and a fire had been set in the hearth. Its warmth did nothing to fade the chill enveloping her chest, nor the icy demeanor of the Laird McNammon. She could see his gaze just barely flick over her as he stood. "The rooms are sufficient." It was not a question, but a statement. Katrina nodded slowly. The bed was far too large for one person, and covered in a beautiful quilt. Across from it the fire blazed merrily, and a chest sat at its end full of her clothing. A wash basin was in the corner, flowers in vases sat on a table by the window as well as beside the fireplace, on the chest at the end of the bed, and a dried bouquet on each pillow. There was a robe set on each side of the bed, and beside her in the chair set before the fire lay a pile of man's clothes, neatly folded. By all appearances, this suite of rooms had been prepared not just for her, but for both of them. Swallowing the ball of sudden nerves, she pushed away every thought, screaming how right the rumors could be, how utterly annoyed she was at this cold treatment, and how much she was dreading what could be in store for this wedding night. And she ventured, "They have been made up beautifully for us." His cheek twitched, and his eyes moved more slowly over her, as if he were only just seeing her for the first time that day. "Aye, they have." Stepping from the corner, he was cast more into the light of the fire. He'd already pulled out the ribbon holding his hair back for the wedding ceremony, and it fell wildly to one side in a mess of black curls. Though shadowed, she could recall the piercing blue of his eyes, and did not need to see the color to know they were every bit as intense as they had been earlier. Dark, thick lashes rose and fell as his gaze flicked over her. The resentment she'd felt before rose right alongside the heat of a blush when his eyes slowly slid over her nearly bare shoulders to her collarbones, up her neck, and paused at her lips. How could he make her stomach coil so quickly with anger while her heart quickened in another feeling entirely, she did not know. But in that moment she resolved not to give in, no matter how pervasive her imagination was. No matter that every deliberate, unhurried step closer heightened this heat swirling in her chest. No matter that she could see the years of active labor on his estate rippling in the width of his shoulders. No matter that his height made her tilt her head upwards, and she, a woman of ungainly stature according to her mother, was rarely made to feel so delicate as now. He stopped just short of touching her, and the back of her neck tingled with expectation. As he had walked to one side of her, she had to turn to see him, and he stood fully illuminated by the light of the fire. Now she could see the sapphire of his eyes had deepened to a stormy gray, and the line of his lips was as tense as every part of her being. Unconsciously she stood a little straighter, breath catching in the back of her throat. She did not intend to back down, whatever his game was. It was their wedding night, and she knew full well what he was entitled to, what was expected of them both. But she would not let him see just how little practical experience she had in the marriage bed. His gaze was steady on her face as he leaned closer. It was all she could do not to avert her eyes or flinch, but her body instinctively took a step back. To her utter dismay, her calf connected with the side of the chair now behind her, and she lost her balance. But before she could even reach out to balance herself, Rhys reacted. One arm shot out and caught her around the waist, and then she was entirely drawn against him. Her hand had fallen on his upper arm, and the sheer muscle she could feel beneath his cotton shirt was nearly as disconcerting as knowing she was entirely reliant on him in that moment to keep her from falling again. For a moment he did not right her, but stood bent over her, holding her firmly against him, face inches away from her lips, eyes steady on her gaze. Katrina opened her mouth to ask him to release her, and his eyes slid down to the movement. A long, unnerving moment passed when she thought he would kiss her, and she could not stop the wild thoughts of what that might be like. A spark shot through her, imagining the feel of his mouth on hers, how soft it might be, how the slight shadow of new beard would scrape her chin, how she'd be pulled even closer until their arms and bodies and breaths were entangled in one swift moment of passion. And just as quickly, a flush of irritation followed that she was so pliable in the trap of his arm around her and the feel of his muscled body bending over her that she could forget the entire day's rudeness in being soundly ignored. And yet, her heart raced. She could smell the ale on his breath and the scent of outdoors that clung to his hair, which was just long enough that it brushed her cheek. She could feel the tensing of his arm as he held her, the firm grip of his fingers on her waist. There was not one part of her body that could not feel the added heat of him against her. And she could hear a sudden catch in his own breathing that set hers entirely erratic. The rushing of her blood in her ears was so loud that she was certain he could sense it when his gaze returned to her own. And then his lips brushed past her cheek as he said low in her ear, "Rest well, Lady McNammon." His other arm reached around her to pick something up from the chair. In a mere second he had righted them both, released her, and walked to the door. Her body felt bereft of the warmth he'd taken with him. Though the room was not cold, goosebumps skittered over her skin. She saw then that he had taken his clothing from the chair, and as he opened the door, he paused and half turned his head. "Should you need anything, your maid Eileen will be in shortly to see you." He left, and with the closing of the door, Katrina felt all of her animosity rise again.